Hey there. Welcome to Season 2 of the Artist in Me is Dead podcast. I'm your host, Rhonda Willers. This second episode features a conversation with Carmen Radley, a writer, editor, and burgeoning visual artist. Carmen is based in Austin, Texas, and her family has been rooted in Texas since the early 1900s. As we talked, she shared that her current personal project is focusing on reclaiming the forgotten place of her hometown of Sour Lake, Texas. I met Carmen through the online writing community and newsletter, The Isolation Journals, where she serves as the managing editor and host of the monthly writing hour called The Hatch. In this conversation, you'll hear how Carmen became a co-collaborator with the founder, author Suleika Jaouad, and how The Isolation Journals has evolved in so many beautiful ways. Carmen's love of literature and her poetics are so evident in this conversation. I can't wait for you to experience it. Please enjoy this episode with Carmen Radley. Well, Carmen, thanks for being here with me today to talk about your creative life. And I'm so excited because you're coming to creativity with a mix of visual arts, but also writing as part of your practice. And so I'm really interested in learning more about that as we talk. If you could, when we start today, just share with us kind of how you came to be where you are today in your creative practice, like in your professional life, but also in just what might be your general creative practice or life that you have and are living. Like, where did it start for you?
I have this sort of judgment of myself, or this story that I tell myself, that my life as a creative person is less valid than some other people, because I feel like I came to it not setting out with some goal in mind and like, these are the steps I'm going to get to that goal, but in a way that feels extremely like almost like I was dropped in a river and have been taken in a way. So if I had to locate the beginning, it would be that when I was in high school, I had this teacher my sophomore year, Cynthia Pivoto, who was she was my English teacher, and she was a very forceful presence and a very dynamic presence. And I had always loved reading, but she identified my talents as a writer. She would use my writing as an example. If we wrote an essay, she would use it put it up on the projector and say why, like point out the merits of it. And then to take it a step further, she selected me. We had these academic competitions. A university and interscholastic lead was like the public school academic competitions. That was the counterpart to the athletic competitions. And she was very selective, and she would choose like 1 to 2 students per year to be on her writing teams. And so she selected me, and I did news writing, feature writing, and ready writing, which is where they would give you a prompt and you would write an essay. It's almost like just a general essay now, the way you would think of like how Rebecca Solnit pulls in quotes from other writers. So that was like my very first kind of the first hint that was something that I was naturally inclined toward. And I've been thinking also about the fact recently, because I've never drawn or never put as much energy into visual arts, because I never, there was this teacher in middle school who, hilariously, my mom had her in middle school. She'd been around forever. And then my older sister had her, and they had such terrible experiences with her. And there were all these stories about how she was actually a witch, and she had this long, like spidery gray hair that went down to her waist, and everyone had stories about Mrs. Dorr the witch. And so I didn't take that. And then there were similar kind of negative stories about the high school art teacher, about being preferential or, just kind of difficult to navigate. And so I never took art classes, even though my mom had, ended up being the art teacher at my high school after I graduated. She was, she didn't finish her college degree until I was actually a senior in high school. So she didn't start teaching until after I was gone. But, I could have been exploring it with her. I could have, and some reason there was like this block there. So it's almost like that river. It was like, I didn't go down that stream. I continued going down this stream of writing, and that kept happening. And I went to college and studied English literature and ended up in a creative writing track, and doing my thesis as a collection of short stories. And then kind of, because I didn't know what else I wanted to do, I decided to apply to a graduate program in fiction. And I did that right out of grad school, right out of college. And I was young and probably didn't have the right stories to tell yet. Like I knew I needed to grow up. So I kind of went on a different path. I went and taught English in middle school and high school for a few years. And then I ended up on a hospital ship in West Africa, working in the communications department as a writer, doing like stories about their relief and development projects. And when I came back from that, this was the first time this was 2008. So financial crisis. I kind of was teaching, but I was also like, well, what do I really want to do? I'm 27 years old. It's like, I have a choice now about how I do this. And I decided, well, what if I wanted to write full time, and what other skills do I need? And I took a photography class at the local community college. And so added a little bit of visual, like, the idea of the elements of art, to my line and color, and the rule of thirds and things like that suddenly became like a little more formalized in my mind.
It gave you visual language. Like that's how when I was teaching, we would talk about visual language. And so you were learning that. Yeah.
Whereas everything else had been very textual, very much about poetry, about alliteration and consonants and assonance and, figuration and these different things. It was very, very, very text based. It did sort of like add this other way of seeing the world and a different type of language. Exactly. And I mean, I could go on and just like give you the blow by blow of everything, but I feel like the bigger point to make was that I have always felt like I just said yes to the thing that kind of made itself available. Like I had an opportunity and I would say, yes, this opportunity to go to West Africa. It was a very weird situation how that happened. I had a student, I was very unhappy teaching. I had a student whose dad was on the board of this organization, and he invited me to learn about this organization, Mercy Ships. And then I ended up going, and it was there that I met a man who needed a book written. And so when I left the ship, I kind of fumbled around and took these photography classes and writing classes. But really what happened is I started writing this book for someone else. And that was what led me down, like being a professional writer, like kind of a workaday journeyman writer, where I said yes to that. And then I said yes to other things. And it just, the work I do now with Suleika Jaouad at the Isolation Journals, as like being the editor of that publication. It all started because she invited me to come and visit and do a 10-day writing retreat with her at her parents' house in upstate New York. Her parents were gone, and she was trying to finish her memoir Between Two Kingdom. And I was trying to work on, a book that I'm writing about the little town where I grew up and on the coastal plains of Texas. And I flew up to visit her on March 9th, 2020, and I didn't leave for 3 months because the pandemic hit, and she started this project. And so it was just saying yes to go visit her that has like led it into like this 3-year kind of incredible and at times heartbreaking, but mostly wondrous experience of helping her found this creative community and newsletter. Saying yes.
Saying yes. I know when you were saying there's so much, you gave me so much to think about as I'm writing notes feverishly as I'm listening, but I want to go back to a couple of things first, and we'll kind of keep moving through. But I was thinking about when you were talking about your teacher, the English teacher from high school, Cynthia, and just that she saw something in you. And, you know, I just want to revisit that a little bit of prior to that. Did you also see creative spark in yourself, or do you feel like her being outside of your family unit, recognizing that was a really significant thing for you?
I wouldn't say I felt like a creative person for that. I loved reading. I felt like a studious person. Like I
Uh-huh.
was very interested in being and doing well in school and sort of very rule abiding. And
Yeah.
I do not have the story. Like I know so many writers who talk about how they barely made it through high school, and
Yeah.
these tortured poets who like had to do remedial classes before they finally went to college. Um, but that wasn't me. I was very, very studious. And
Mm.
um, my family, my mom didn't work outside the home until after I graduated from
Mhm.
high school, as I said. And so there was a way that I just sort of saw myself in living a very conventional, traditional path of a
Yeah.
woman, of married and having children, and
Mhm.
did not think. And my dad was, his work was very. They were industrial electricians that worked mainly in the oil fields of Southeast
Sure.
Texas, and that was like dirty, mucky, hard blue collar work.
Yep.
And uh, it's not that there wasn't art in our lives. It's not that there wasn't literature. It was just that didn't, a creative life was not, no, the life of an artist was not something you did. My uncle, my dad's brother, had gone to, he'd gone to art school.
Mhm.
He studied ceramics at the University of North Texas, which has a pretty
Oh,
decent
yeah.
art program,
Yeah.
and had even done a master's in ceramics, and had, we still have these pieces of like these gorgeous paintings that he made, or
Mhm.
the pottery. And he had a job where he was going to go teach ceramics at Grand Canyon University in Arizona, this private university in Arizona. And at the last minute, he quit to come back and be with
Mhm.
family and work
Mhm.
in the family oil business, this industrial electrical business in the oil field.
Mhm.
And the artist narrative was like the only one was curtailed.
Yeah.
So no, I wouldn't have thought it possible. And I don't think I even thought it possible until, even though I knew that someone else had seen this spark in me, the idea of that being how I would live my life, it felt way too hard.
Yeah.
It felt like you were just going to be poor. You were going to be struggling all the time. It was going to be
Yes.
rejection.
Yes.
It's not.
I still did you in Texas, did you have the commercials for the Starving Artist show? Like we would always have these commercials in Minneapolis area where they'd be like starving artist paintings at the whatever by Mall of America. Like they would have these commercials, and that is how they said it. Like that.
Gosh, no, I don't remember that. But also there were long periods of our life where we didn't have a television because my mom was, what was on TV was too worldly, and we were.
Oh, yes. I feel like we might, based on dates you were sharing, I'm like, I think we kind of grew up similar generations. And there was definitely eras of like not doing things. Like my mom didn't let us do Halloween for many years. And then when we finally did get to do Halloween, we had to go as angels. Like, I mean, it
Yeah.
was sort of
There were definitely no
ridiculous.
devils. We were not allowed to be devils for Halloween.
Oh, but thinking about that path too, of whether you have examples before you to show you that this is a possibility is such a formative thing, because if you don't see it, you don't know. And then now, because there's so much accessibility to possibilities, I feel like that is a great gift to other people, but there's still residual hangovers of belief of like, no, you can't make a life in a creative way, or you won't sustain yourself financially for that. I think that narrative still is kind of popping around. But I look forward to when that doesn't happen anymore. And
Yeah.
that my optimism is that it will shift
Yeah.
for everybody. But
It is. It's. I mean, the the writer's version of this is obviously Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which the first time I read that book, I think I was maybe 22. You know, and it's an incredible book where she just sort of, it's written as a 100-page nonfiction essay, but it's an imagined journey across the men's campus at maybe Cambridge or Oxford, and going into one of their like supper clubs and the delicious feast they have, and then access to all the books that they have, and all access not only to the books, but also these examples of people who came before them. And then she contrasts it with, going to this, the women's college, and this like paltry meal she eats, like stewed prunes or something, just something that tastes horrible. And I read that when I was 22, and it made sense. And then it's amazing how reading it again, I think I maybe read it again 2 or 3 years ago. And I had my notebook, and I was just outlining the brilliance of the argument and the brilliance of the piece. And it also makes me sad that sometimes it takes so long to learn the thing that you look back and you're like, oh, if I had only really taken that to heart at 22 and started making searching in that way. But, then of course, I started it at 38 or 39,
right.
or however so probably can't be too mad at myself.
Well, no. And then also I just saw this exhibition that was called To Illuminate Abundance. And it asked Black femme artists, designers to imagine a future of abundance. And the thought, like what you just described too, though, is imagining abundance of another way of living. And just, I feel like it's a theme I've personally been really hearing a lot as of late, and thinking about how often have I stopped that abundant future dream, and why have I stopped it? And like, even when you were describing, not seeing many creative examples, or the one creative life that was in your family, it was like halted and changed for coming back to the family. So then does that experience, or how does that experience impact then your ability to imagine what an abundant future looks like in both your creative life and just life in general? And
hugely.
Yeah.
And it also makes me think, that the stories we tell ourselves is so important. And even just like continuing to say this word abundance, like if that's the story you're putting out, Rhonda, like what a gift to the world. Like focus on that yourself, and then also to share that with other people. There is enough, that there is a path that
that each person is enough. I was just with some students, and they were like, I'm just worried, wondering about things. And I just said, everything you do is enough, and everything you do matters just as it is. You don't have to strive to make it matter more. It will just matter because it's you. That's
There's like
it.
a settling in my gut that I feel when you say that. It is so, amazing.
But it's hard to trust it too, which is such a funny thing. Like, why don't we trust that our gift to bring is just simply being and doing just as we are, just as, and the yes, like the fact that you've said yes as these things have presented themselves to you, like that's part of your gift and part of your abundance, is that you're saying yes when something comes. When you were thinking about saying yes, I'm thinking about the mercy ship, and that you mentioned before that you were unhappy in the teaching experience. So was the yes opportunity to escape, or was it an opportunity to move forward into something else, or was it something else completely?
I think it was like equal parts escape and like a foray into the unknown. I was teaching at a school that I was very unhappy with. It was a private school where the kids kind of ran the place. The administration was in flux and not very supportive. And I was teaching 3 preps. So I was teaching 8th grade English, 12th grade English, and creative writing. And my day was bouncing between those two. So I would go from having, a class of seniors who knew everything, who were cooler than everything, but also could grapple with complex ideas in a way that I found interesting. And then going to 8th graders who were like extremely lovely in so many ways, where like they loved me, they were excited, they were, enthusiastic, they were still precocious, felt precocious because they were
Yeah.
still young, but also they would come into class and their backpacks would like explode immediately, and every book would like fall all over the room, but then they didn't have the one book that they needed for the class, and I was just ripping my hair out, like going between these very, very different ages and sort of cognitive abilities and personalities, and dealing with difficult administration. And what really ended up happening was that it was there was this event, there's a interfaith alliance here in Austin that, it is what it says. It's like Christian, Buddhist, Hindu,
Yeah.
Muslim, and Jewish council that they organize interfaith events, and they were doing a Thanksgiving event, and they had rented out the facilities for this school, the church that owned this, that ran this school. It rented out the facilities to have this Thanksgiving event, and then at the last minute, they canceled the contract with the Interfaith Alliance because the church learned that they were going to allow the Muslim contingent to go and pray, do their daily prayers in a different room. And they were like, oh, we cannot allow praying to a different God under our roof. And I was like, well, technically it's the same God,
Just has a different name.
It's like the God of like Abraham. They're both Abrahamic traditions. Like, this is first of all ignorant, but second of all, just I didn't want to be associated with that school anymore. And there were other things going on in my life. I had this on again, off again relationship, and I was like, I need to get the hell out of here for a little while.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, and I've like have an opportunity to go live and work in West Africa for a year. And that's a place I've never been, a place I probably never would have been drawn. And so it was both. It was the escape and it was the foray into the unknown. And it also felt like one of the things that I think about when I have said yes on these different levels is that it felt right. I had actually applied to be a teacher in the school, and they didn't have a teacher position open, but they had a writer in the communication department open. And I was like, well, that's what I've always loved, is like telling stories. And it felt right also because I had always been writing fiction, but those fictions that I was writing were thinly veiled autobiography. It was real stories that I was compelled by. And not to say, I mean, actually now I'm like very dying to get back to writing fiction, but there was a time in my life where I felt that at that time I felt very, very compelled to write true stories. And so there was a way that yes felt extremely resonant and easy to do.
When you've had these different jobs, we'll say, did you also continue to write for personal pursuit throughout that time, or did that set aside while you were doing this work?
I think I took up teaching because I thought I would be able to write, but it was brutal. It was just, especially in the first few years. I think it gets easier. I didn't make it through that
that hurdle of like
fire. I got burned up. I was burned to a crisp. So I quit before I really figured out the systems and the efficiencies that a lot of long-term teachers figure out. So I just didn't have, I was wiped. I also have learned that I am much more of an introvert, that I need a lot of time by myself, that I need to be alone in my house and be reading poems or stories and in quiet. And so that experience of teaching was extremely
draining, probably.
Defeating. And now it's a little bit challenging because I work and I spend so much time, and I would say even coming back from that writing job on the hospital ship, the balance between what I write to make a living and what I write because this is like a story I'm dying to tell, it has been a challenge and continues to be a challenge because the thing that I get paid to write is always more satisfying immediately, because I can rationalize why I need to be paying attention to that. And I also am sending it off to someone who is expecting it from me.
Yep.
And so, if I'm writing a social caption to put on the Isolation Journal's Instagram, it's immediately someone's going to be like, oh, I love this. And it's that immediate feedback. Whereas if I have this book project that I've been, story I'm telling about my family working in these oil fields in a place that is now flooding because of climate change. That story is deeply one I want to tell, but it's hard to tell. It's inventing a form that I haven't, I've been, pushing around in the dark and trying to like discover the form for it for a long time, but it's solitary and lonely, and I don't get feedback from it, immediate feedback that whether good or bad. So that balance is challenging. And
it's always, well, I don't know if it's always, but it feels, for me, I'll speak for myself, I have an easier time prioritizing things that other people are going to be receiving than things that are just for my own personal curiosity exploration. And it's all the things you've shared about why, because there's, immediate feedback, there's expectation that's over there. And so I've been trying to figure out, how do I build expectation for myself so that if I don't tend to the thing that is my personal pursuit, it's an accountability, but how do I get myself in the practice of sort of receiving that or checking that with my own self? Like, I have a project, it sounds, there's similarity. I have an ongoing project I started 2 years ago, or no, it'll be 3 years ago, because it was when my grandmother died, and I'm still working on it. And I'm like, you should have this done. It's so easy. You can see it in your head. You know what this thing is. And yet it always gets deprioritized because the external deadlines are easier to say, like, I've got to meet that person's expecting that. And
is that a people pleasing thing, or is that like part of your personality?
I don't know. It's scary to think it's a people pleasing thing, because I think I try to think I don't do that.
Okay, well, maybe I'm projecting.
No, but it might be, though. That's like one of those things of like, am I learning or unlearning something? Like, was I raised to be a people pleaser without realizing it? What does that look like? When I spoke with my grandmother, she was not a people pleaser. And so we heard about that a lot, how she didn't please people, but she made a lot of progress. But my mom was the opposite, became a people pleaser because she was so uncomfortable with how her mother made people uncomfortable. So
oh my gosh, the action reaction.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? What is that looking like for you, of like building in that externality for yourself?
I think it goes to a strategy I use of time blocking. So I block off time in each day for what projects or things I'm working on. And so it's making myself block 1 hour for that project on this day, and then doing it and ignoring something else.
That's so I have started every day. I've been making to-do lists for every day, and I've just started it. I mean, for a lot of reasons, I've been away from my own creative practice because things were kind of an upheaval with Suleika, my business partner, she relapsed with leukemia in November of 2021. And just the amount of shifting and adjusting we had to do. And at the same time, we saw a lot of growth and people really being interested in her story in that way. So it just changed the entire complexion of my work. But and there was a way, I talked to a novelist recently who was saying she was doing this motion where she was taking her hands in the middle of her forehead and like wiping it, almost like windshield wipers. So like opening curtains, actually, is what it looked like. And saying my head has to be clear. And there was a way that everything from like daily responsibilities to her sister had gotten sick and had died of cancer. And so the grief and the tumult of that was, it was keeping her from getting to the page and making
Yep.
progress on a novel in the way that she wanted to.
Yeah.
And I think there was a way that in this whole year of Suleika being sick and us having to navigate these very difficult things, it was really hard to prioritize something that requires a lot of clarity of mind and requires a lot of focus and delving into difficult, complex subjects. And so recently I've felt a little bit more clarity, and I've been blocking into my schedule first thing in the morning, work on my Sour Lake book. Sour Lake is the name of the town where I grew up. And there is a way that even if I don't make it into that hour at the beginning of the day, if I've written it on my schedule for the day, maybe I'll even 30 minutes or an hour before I go to sleep, just add 300 words to the document, one page,
one page. It's the small little things will add up. And it's sometimes hard to believe that small little action is going to add up to something more later, even though we know it does. So if you can get yourself to that spot of doing it. I want to go back to talking about the clarity of mind and how different parts, because one of the things with the podcast is talking to people about when things sort of get in the way of their creativity or stop their creativity to some extent. And having a clear mind is a really interesting one to dig into in the ways that grief is something I explore in a lot of my visual work too, and the way that does cloud so much of what happens in life. And when we're going through, like with Suleika and her illness coming back, like that's a form of grief that you're all dealing with and moving through. And that is a thick cloud. Like it's just impossible for it not to be, I think, in my experience of losses that happens. I think there's like 2 years of life after each major thing that I have very bad memory recall of for my own self, because it just, I don't, it's sort of weird because people will say like, oh, I remember this from this time, and I do not remember it. And I know that there's science behind it too, but just how that does impact creative practice because we are in that. And how do you what this visual that you gave of pulling the curtains from your forehead area that your friend shared with you, the novelist, like there are different healing methods where people do that same sort of thing, where they're like they talk about like removing cloaks of things, and that's a way to free your sort of spirit soul. And I guess I'm just curious if you could share more about how do you recognize when you are in that sort of thick cloud of space where the creativity isn't flowing out? Like, do you see it as it's coming on, if you will, or building up? Or do you feel like it's something that you don't recognize until you're in it, like rather deep or somewhere in the spectrum?
I feel like my any bouts of like extreme sadness or moments where I've experienced what probably was clinical depression, although I've never been, treated for it particularly. They're situational. I'm very fortunate that I don't struggle with chronic depression or other, sort of generalized anxiety to a degree that people I know who that they experience it. It creeps up in that way, and then they can't recognize it. Mine has always been like a very inciting moment. Suleika got sick in November 2020. Very clear. Suddenly you're like down a well. You're like plunged into an abyss. The same thing happened. I was married, and ended up getting a divorce, and that was very clearly like we were having a hard time, but suddenly getting a divorce is this like rupture. And what I remember from that time is like, heartbreak is run of the mill. We've all had our hearts broken. It didn't mean that mine wasn't valid or wasn't real, but it was sort of like, I'm not going to sit here and like start writing this newsletter about my own heartbreak, or writing a memoir about the fact that I'm going through a divorce. It's just, this is the thing I have to get through. And I saw it immediately as a mountain I had to trudge up. Like it was going to be And I saw it as like not a steep mountain, but like a very long, in the distance, there was a peak, and I was going to have to just put one foot in front of the other and trudge up this mountain until suddenly I would come down on the other side. And I saw it as a very steep descent. Like I was going to be,
Yeah.
going to fall off. I was going to be fine. It didn't end up.
Maybe you were going to fly off instead.
Yeah,
like you were going to drop. You're just going to like project and fly. Cause you're like, I'm free. I got this.
Maybe it was that I was going to like go up in one of those like, matchbox cars and like shoot off the edge of it. But, I found that I had to ground myself in a physical routine. So I signed up for a marathon. It's kind of a cliche thing to do, but I was like, I was going to do a half marathon. I had been running and I was like, oh, I want to do a 10K. Maybe I'll do a half marathon. Yep. And then I found this, I was back in Texas and I was going to do this, looking for places where I didn't have to fly to run somewhere. And there's a little town in West Texas called Marathon that has the marathon to marathon. Awesome. And I was like, I can't do a half marathon to marathon. I'm going to do the whole thing. And it was probably ill-advised because I didn't do an actual training. I didn't sign up with a coach. I didn't get a nutritionist. I just like trudged my way across West Texas and, but there was a physical thing to it. And writing through it was important. I didn't write things publicly, but I journaled about it, and it was, kind of like dilating those knots, like finding a way to like loosen them and expand them. And time. Yeah, time. But it doesn't happen unless you are I think you do have to take some sort of action in your own healing, and whether that's making sure that you're eating well or sleeping well or getting the right amount of physical activity, that your brain chemistry can regulate itself, or that you're engaging with words or with paint or with clay in a way that feels like you're taking ownership of it. Yeah.
I was thinking about the parallels between a journal and a sketchbook. And because you shared like what's for public and what's for not. And like often our sketchbooks are, as visual artists, aren't considered our public space. They often get shown in museums later, but they aren't when you're working typically. And I wonder if you can talk a little more about how you know when something needs to be worked through in the journal versus something that needs to be worked through as a potential public piece.
Yeah, I mean, normally it's, well, I would say there are two. Normally it's when there's confusion around it, when you're looking for clarity at something. That's not to say that you can't work through something in what ends up being a draft of something that's public. Like sometimes that you write your way through there too, but I think it's a different degree of nebulousness when something is extremely nebulous and you don't even know what to do with it. It's so much easier to work through it. And I think it matters working through it. I would never journal on my computer. Like I know a lot of people would keep a daily log or that's more comfortable for them to write on their journal. But my journal is by hand, and there is something about the physicality of stretching my words across the page, and also going back and looking like what did my handwriting look like that day? Like, how choppy were my, how short were my sentences? That there's something is revealed in that physical act and of writing through that.
That reminds me, there was a piece I saw. It was a collaboration between the visual artist Anne Hamilton, who does large scale installation work, and then the poet Susan Stewart, I think is her name. And Susan, I believe, wrote a poem, and then Anne wrote it out on cloth fabric and wound it up into sort of like a movie reel. And the two of them each had their own, and at their performance, they read at the pace of their hand. So it was however far they could pull out the poem, they would read it. And then the other person would pull out and read to their pace of their hand. And so the poem ends up being read in round, even though, but it's at not a predictable round.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was so powerful. They did this at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts for an exhibition so many years ago now, but it still has just stayed with me, this idea of reading at the pace of your hand. And like what you were just sharing about journaling and nebulous ideas, and what does a nebulous idea look like out in, is it scattered papers on the floor with little snippets of the words, and what would that be like to think about and perform in a way or something? There's just something about it that's kind of connecting for me.
I love the way I need to be around visual artists more, because that's so exciting to think about, even how quickly you came up with that visual analog of what it might look like to parse through something, or to dissect something that's nebulous. The other thing that came to mind when you first started asking this question about grief, and I think that this is where, for me, the not having a visual art practice, although I do some photography, as I said, and did start drawing a little bit last spring, was watching Suleika, who she took up painting right after she relapsed, as you know, and this beautiful thing she said to her mother, which was like, I don't want to write now, I want to paint, because the writing feels scary, grappling with it in that direct of a way, so baldly, I have to say the thing I'm fearing. Whereas if you're painting the thing you're fearing, it can take it can take shapes, it can be oblique. And I think that that's a real tool, and something that I'm really wish I had more of, and of course can cultivate more of and want to. So.
Right. Oh, that made me think about, I was just a visiting artist at a university, and one of the students there, Christopher Williams, I think is his last name, if I'm remembering right, but he was building his own specific fantasy world. And he also had a theater background, and he talked about the agreement in a theater of the audience and the performers, and that you both have an agreement when you come to a performance that you're going to believe the fantasy world that is presented for you on the stage, and those on the stage are going to put on that fantasy for you. And just thinking about that, even what you described as Suleika's painting practice, it's creating a safe fantasy space to dig through something that is hard, and it keeps distance between you and that thing. And with writing, you have to work really hard to write metaphor or write a fantasy about the thing you are experiencing, because no matter what, the words will connect back. Even back when you were saying you used to try to write fiction, but it was thinly veiled as autobiography. That's what that feels like, I think. There's so much to that.
Yeah.
It's just, you could try, but no matter what, you're going to see, which I think is why I haven't ever tried to write fiction, because I feel like it would always relate back to my life in some way. Could I truly fabricate something, where maybe in visual arts, I feel like I can fabricate a thing that isn't here. But then again, maybe it's all just me still.
Although I will say that most fiction writers are their own lives are the source material, Not to say that everyone is here. I heard this one person, I was listening to the New Yorker Fiction podcast, and the writer Elif Batuman was referencing some psychologist, I can't remember the woman's name, but who was saying that all fiction writers are writing about their own lives, and they're doing it like people like Proust, Marcel Proust, or Virginia Woolf are writing about their parents in fiction because they can't bear to write them in nonfiction. And I don't know that that's true. I think sometimes the stories that from our lives that we're interested in examining, we're not necessarily interested in examining them because they are our lives. We're not attached to them as material that other people need to know about us. We're interested in them because their problems are sort of little intricacies that we want to like study and understand the different facets of them, rather than like, I'm so obsessed in this solipsistic way with like my own precious suffering or my own precious preoccupations. But yeah, fiction writers it's hard to get away from your own experience and totally invent a different world. I mean, some sci-fi writers do it, but it's probably the wizard is probably always their dad.
Well, and it makes me think too, like in any creative practice, you can choose the place from which you make decisions. So you can choose to make decisions that are rooted in your own life experience, but come out in abstract ways. So people don't have to know that that's your source decision-making process. I can't always articulate that thought the way I want to articulate it, but just that you can use that, like if in my visual language, sometimes with joined forms, I would put some closer together and some further apart. And it was about sibling relationship and feeling closer. I didn't care if my viewer knew that that was about sibling relationship. I wanted them to get the bigger thing of like feeling close to something and feeling distant to something else at the same time. So like being able to decide from that place.
But do people ever say, is this about your siblings?
No, they don't. But I don't name them like family or sisters, which I could.
I do think that the biographical fallacy is like something we reach for because when we don't know what to do with a piece of art, when we're uncomfortable with like our own response to it or understanding our own response to it, or, and we think that we need to know the artist's intent in order for our response to be valid.
Yeah.
And this is one thing that I'm always uncomfortable in interviews when someone's like to ask an actor, who plays a daughter of whose mom died. They're like, you were playing this daughter whose mom died and your mom died. Did you draw on your own experience of your mom dying to do this? And it's like, oh goodness, it's on the nose. Can we just like maybe not need to pin it so much to the artist's own life and biographical details?
Oh, because we can be so fragile at times talking about that place. And it's like, I don't know. I always think about like when that vulnerable, fragile place like hinders my ability to clearly communicate, it's really annoying. So in an interview like that actor ends up moving to that place that's really tight and vulnerable. And then they probably can't talk about the work that they're doing in this because of that being brought up. Yeah.
And it still forecloses the available, if we're limited to that actor, the available interpretations or how it can resonate out, and how, maybe I'm not someone who's lost my mom, but I can have some other kind of grief that illuminates for me. And there's a I think it's T.S. Eliot who wrote an essay where he talked about how a poet never wants to explain his or her work for two reasons. One, it either shows that the work is a failure, that they did not achieve their intention, or the second thing is that it forecloses the possible meanings that they didn't intend. So it both like reveals it both pushes it toward failure and forecloses on possibility.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. And then that makes me think about when you're trying to ask questions of someone else about their creative work and the way that you can better ask open questions so that it doesn't slide, it doesn't close that thing. And it doesn't make it smaller. Wow.
Make it bigger.
Make it bigger.
Make it bigger. More possibility.
Well, I love Janine Antoni, who's our artist who uses her body a lot. She's she had a show in Texas, but it was in Houston. But anyways, one of the things I love that she said during a talk was she said that I found that the more that I go inward to myself, that there is the oneness of all of us there. And just that there is like in specificity becomes a bigger, broader connectedness. And like, how do we always make space for that broader connectedness when we're thinking about creative practice, creative work, where it goes? Just love that thought of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I want to go back to your project with Suleika and the isolation journals and how you said yes to a 10-day writing retreat with her at her parents' house. I love this so very much for so many reasons. But can you tell us, expand on that story, that experience a bit more of how did you meet at a writing residency or was it at your MFA program?
MFA program. We both were
Okay.
doing the Bennington Writing Seminars, which is essentially a 2-year independent study. It was a really it was a great experience. You know, you worked on solo for the semester and then met for 10-day increments in Bennington, Vermont. Beautiful, beautiful bucolic setting in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And Suleika and I sat next to each other at the orientation on our first day, but we didn't really become buddies until I was training for my marathon then, and she was training for a half marathon. And we went on an 11-mile ride that involved like her having an asthma attack and us like deciding to go like swimming in a lake, and talked about everything. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I was like recently getting a divorce, and she would call me. She's a cold caller, and she would call me every month on the first of the month when we would have these packets. We would have to send in original work and some critical essays based on the reading we would have to do that month. And every month on the first, I could rely on just like getting a call out of the blue from Suleika, and we just sort of had rapport. But even her inviting me, I was like, 10 days at someone's house is a long time. I think she can't possibly mean 10 days, but okay. And then when I got there, within 3 or 4 days, it was clear that things were going wild. And we drove up. I flew in on a Sunday. We drove up to upstate. I flew into New York City on a Sunday. We drove upstate on a Wednesday. And by Friday, her partner and her brother left New York City and came upstate to stay with us.
Wow.
And they were planning on just spending the weekend there because things were a little weird in New York City. And then they never went back.
Wow.
And so it was the 4 of us. We ended up in this little commune where I was working on grad school, and I was also had a job. I worked for a private publisher doing these biographies. And Suleika was also finishing grad school and also doing edits to her book, finishing her memoir. And she asked me to help like do one final edit. And we were just, and then she came up with this idea of the isolation journals. And I was like, Suleika, you already have enough on your plate. I do not know what you're doing. It didn't have a name at that point, but she just saw people were really struggling, and that on social media that they were kind of like had no anchor, that everything was an upheaval. They didn't know what this virus was. They didn't know what to do with themselves. They weren't going to work. And she just said, when I was sick with leukemia the first time, I had this 100-day project that I did with my family. We all chose one creative act a day. Mine was journaling. I'm going to invite everyone on my newsletter to join me in doing these journaling prompts that I'm going to send out from different artist friends and creative, community leaders and different types of creative people. And I remember her talking about it, and we were doing yoga. We were going to do some yoga and like kind of not just be at our desks. And 2 minutes into yoga, she's like, I think I want to do this thing. And I said, go write it down. Cause I didn't want her to forget it, but I also knew we needed to do yoga. And it just, it was kind of all hands on deck because it took off, and there were probably about 5 of us working on it part-time. But I was with her so much, I was living with her, and I ended up staying because the alternative was me coming back to Austin where I live to be in my apartment alone. And I was like, well, it's much better to be with Suleika and her brother and her partner, because then I had people to eat dinner with, and we, we were all kind of like figuring out our little niches in the house, and we figured out our routines, and her brother had made us a chore chart, and we were figuring out how to be, it's kind of like being back in college. It was really fun. And the fascinating part about it is that it was just like something, the form of it was not determined. We didn't know what it was going to be. We didn't know. she's a very intuitive person, and she has extremely good instincts, and amazingly, just the form that the first newsletter took was something that we could adapt from and grow. And it's essentially still the same newsletter. She sends out a little introductory note, and then there's a little essay and prompt from a contributor, and we've added different things. We'll do different challenge. It was a 100-day project at first, and now it's weekly, because sending out a daily email.
Sending out a weekly email is something that in my head, I'm like, that's so much. That's so much.
Yeah. The daily was a grind. The daily was a grind. And when we have returned to daily things, we try nobody wants to get a daily email. So even if we have a daily challenge, we've changed the packaging so that people aren't just being barraged in their inbox every day, because goodness gracious, we have made our own lives miserable with this extremely inconvenient thing of email. But yeah, it's inventing something from nothing. We even have a hard time sometimes talking about what it is, because we say it's a newsletter because that's how it goes out, but it's this, as you're a part of it. It's a creative community where we kind of grapple with the harder things, and we walk through these passages together, and we kind of witness each other's stories. We take our own stories and transform them into something else. And it's truly an adventure that we don't ever know what to expect. And
I think what's so beautiful about it, from like the community side of it too, is something you just said. It's that bearing witness to someone else. And I was raised in a different Christian churches growing up. So that phrase was familiar to me from church.
But was it bear false witness? I
can't even remember. That's so weird. I just remember the phrase of bear witness. And there probably was the word false, but I probably took it out because I didn't like it. I'm a very selective religious person where I'm like, I don't like that. So I'm going to just pull that out. The idea of bearing witness and what that really means to people. And, I think when you're a teacher, you see that. When I was a visual arts teacher, I saw that working with students. I was bearing witness to their creativity, to the fact that their ideas were valid, to that their processes were important. And that just that act alone builds such care, but also confidence. And so in this community, when people are sharing and they're affirming for each other, it's giving so much care to one another to say your life matters, your experience matters. And it feels so straightforward that's impactful, but that is so deeply impactful for people. And that is harder to articulate to someone. What's it about? It's a newsletter. It's a newsletter that makes people feel really cared for and connected. And and people are really? Yes, it is. It does. Yeah. I mean, I still think about my friend Hannah is the one who forwarded it to me. And she was just like, hey, I think you'd like this community. That's kind of the thing she did. And I was like, okay. So I just started following along. And it was during those first 100 days of the pandemic time when I first saw it. Yeah.
I love that.
It kind of goes back to that discussion around keeping things open and not narrowing something in. And even as the originator, so to speak, of an idea or of an experience, like you all with the isolation journals, if you had narrowed your own thoughts about well, it's only going to be this, you would have lost out on all these other experiences that have come from it. And how, when we can keep ourselves both directed but open, how much comes back to us from that, how much, that's more than what we could have even imagined.
I mean, absolutely. And I think that this is where Suleika is a great teacher for me, is that I have, to return to this abundance idea that you shared earlier, I don't know that I have proceeded in life with an abundance mentality, or a sense, well, why isn't this possible? Shouldn't this be possible? And Suleika is a visionary in that way, where I feel like her example of saying, I can make this happen. I can pitch a New York Times column when I'm 22 years old in a
Yeah.
hospital bed being treated for leukemia. It's a kind of energy, and I don't mean ambition in a negative
Yeah.
way, but it's a self-belief that I find extremely inspiring, that I want to cultivate more of in my life. It makes me want to cultivate more of it in my life.
Mm-hmm. I think, you said the word ambition, and I've had a lot of conversations with people about that word, because I always say I'm not competitive, but I am ambitious. And I think that there's a difference there. Like when we're talking about competition, then it's a scarcity of like only one person or one thing can rise up. But when it's ambition, everyone has the opportunity to be ambitious, to move forward, to move bigger, to move differently. And like that's a huge comfort to me that we can all have that. And there's also just I wonder if she also has this thought of like, why not? Like, why not send that email, that idea? Because I mean, in the visual arts, you get rejected all the time. And sometimes you get like a verbal written rejection. Sometimes you just hear nothing at all. And so you get used to like, well, the worst thing that's going to happen is someone's going to say no. And like, I can endure that. Like, that's just kind of, like, I always say my family loves me to myself. I'm like, my family loves me. I'm good. Like,
Well, and the one thing that I read recently, again, that I need to practice more of is the practice of, there was an article on Lit Hub where a woman wrote about, rather than collecting successes, like acceptances, she was like collecting rejections, and she was like aiming for 100 rejections a year. And what that would mean is that, I've heard different rules of thumb, but a poet friend of mine said, I've heard this idea that if you submit 20 poems, you get one acceptance. So if you get 5, if you're a writer and you send out 100 different submissions, whether it's to a writing residency, whether it's to some sort of publication, and you get 5 acceptances, that's like that means 5 acceptances.
yes.
And also if you flip that rejection on its head, and it becomes like, okay, I did the work. That was just the work I had to do, rather than this thing that completely throws you off kilter because it means something about your work or your value or something like that. That's extremely powerful. Also, something I need to practice more.
There's so many things. I always just say, I'm just practicing. Like everything in life is it's a practice, because it just is. Like, to keep doing something means you are practicing, and that's okay. Like, that's kind of a great place to be, is to just practice away.
Yeah.
One thing I want to go back to with you is also about your own book and your project there. So Sour Lake, right? Is everything done right? And can you tell us more about, are you writing this? And you already have a plan of where you're going to publish it, or are you writing it and then you will be submitting it? Kind of tell us a little more about where you are in the process of it, and what's driven you to this personal project at this time.
Well, it started many years ago because my father wanted me, he was born in this little town of 2,000 people on the Gulf Coast of Texas. That was an oil resort. It was it was a health resort before it was an oil boom town. So there was this small sour lake that, it had this smell of sulfur, and it had oil that floated up to the top of it. So it had this skim of oil on it, and there was sort of tar beds all around it, and it very much changed size and depth with the rainy, if it was rainy or not. It wasn't like a lake. It wasn't Lake Tahoe. It was just kind of like a sloughly, sour thing. But this speaks to the state of medical care in the 1840s. It was like the great hope was going to bathe in this water and to take the mud and make some sort of poultice for eczema, or to drink the water for dyspepsia, or even drink the oil.
Wow.
As they called it, a catharetic, which I guess means it clears you out. I'm not really.
Yeah, like castor oil. Isn't that what that is for? Like, is that
Yeah,
what that
I
is?
think
Okay.
so. But this is petroleum. I mean, it's really, really, really kind of strange. I mean, they would sell it for like $1 for like a quarter, like a
like a quart of it or
quart
something.
of it would be it was even smaller than a quart. It doesn't, the
Oh,
details
wow.
don't matter, but it was. And then in the early 20th century, there was the very first oil fields in Texas were discovered. First one was in 1901 in a town not far from Sour Lake called Beaumont. And it was a very famous, world famous gusher called the Lucas Gusher at a place called Spindletop. And it was the first time that oil in commercially viable quantities had been found outside of sort of Pennsylvania, West Virginia. And they actually didn't think that the geology of a place like the Gulf Coast, which is all very unconsolidated sands, clays, and it's not, there's no rock. It's all just very freshly laid sediments that have like worn down from the Rocky Mountains and from other parts of the Great Plains and things. So they found oil in 1901 in Beaumont, and then everywhere else. This was at the time where they didn't have any of the instrumentation they had. So the main way of finding oil was called creekology, which is you would go and where there was a creek or some sort of, it would like oil would be seeping up. And so they went to any place where there were seepages, and the Sour Lake was one of them. And it was a second oil field on the Gulf Coast. And it was, they found it right when, for lots of reasons, the Spindletop oil field was depleted because they had very, very inefficient ways of producing the oil. They took way too much at once. They wasted a ton of oil, so that within like a year, this oil field was depleted, and they needed new resources to kind of get this to market. So they found oil at Texaco. It was their discovery well was at Sour Lake in 1903. And my family has been in the oil business there since in various forms since then.
Wow.
And the book for a long time I was really interested in sort of reclaiming this place as a forgotten place and sort of doing it because my dad loved this place. And I feel haven't lived there since I was 18 or 19, but it very much is, even now when I go back, it's like there's something deep inside, deep attachment to it, to the way the air feels, to the way the landscape looks, even though it's not a landscape that anybody would choose to like. This is not some pristine mountainscape, even a beautiful prairie. It's like this kind of scrubby coastal plain, and so I started there. And what's been challenging about it is that the world has changed so quickly. So it was, and also, it's also been a challenge to figure out how to make this story hold together. So it's a very piecemeal history. It's not the history of New York City where there were 10 different newspapers and there were lots of different important people keeping journals and records and sending letters. It's a place of boom and bust. And so there would be, one newspaper like called the Sour Lake Situation, and there are no copies left. Like you'll hear about the Sour Lake Situation in a different newspaper. It'll be referenced, but there are no extant copies of it.
Wow.
So formally it was a challenge because I was relying on a lot of different information and how to weave these things together. And also then personally it was a challenge because I didn't really want to center myself in this book. I didn't want to, I felt like it was a story I was discovering, but it wasn't really my story. And so that was complicated. But what I've figured out in this like long evolving process is, one that I had to be a part of it because it's a place I care about it, and nobody's going to care about it if I don't explain to them why they should. But more than that, I took it as kind of self-evident that every place deserved to have its story told. And maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that anyone is going to want to read it, or that everyone is going to read it, or that it has a wider audience. And so to go back to this idea that you had earlier of the particular as the universal, I feel like the particular here is me and my love for my father and my father's work in this oil field, the way that he spent his life here, the way he toiled this way. And then there's this newfound knowledge in the last, I mean, we could go as far back to the late 1970s when people started talking about climate change, but my dad probably only accepted man-made climate change in the last 10 years. And what it means to be, for him to have been a part of this extremely challenging future that we're looking to, causing this extremely challenging future that we're looking at. Although, of course, we're all complicit in it because we're all consuming fossil fuels, and very few of us are actually making huge, meaningful changes in our lives that we need to make for this to change. But also then what it means for me to look at those stories that we've told ourselves and to say, like, what happens when the stories that we've told ourselves change, and when we lose that and we lose that anchor. I think you asked earlier if I'm writing it myself. The book world is, I mean, I guess I could have been super ambitious and figured out the proposal for this and gotten an agent and started trying to sell it on spec, but it's been such a discovery process as the world has changed, as we've gotten into the Paris Climate Accords, as we've gotten out of the Paris Climate Accords, as we, as Hurricane Harvey hit my hometown and made it an island and flooded thousands and thousands of people, dumped so much water on the Gulf Coast of Texas that it actually shifted the continental plate, you know, was depressed by a centimeter. Like, just wild things have happened. And so I am writing it for, like, with no promise that it will ever be published, but with the knowledge that I have freedom in that to really figure out what the book needs to be before the forces of the market kind of come to try to shape it. Like, well, what's going to be the most sellable? Like, what's going to be the most marketable?
It's so, well, just even hearing you talk, I mean, I hear like at least three themes. Like, I hear your first one you articulated of the love of your father and that experience. You also talked about the love of the land and that it's an unexpected space to love, which then is also a really universal thought of, like, the love of anything that's an unexpected thing to love. And like, what does that look like? And what does that mean? Because there's so many ways that comes about in our lifetime. And then the environmental one too, which obviously is very on point topically at this where we are as a juncture. And then the grappling of the narrative change, the story you tell yourself about yourself, but even like, I think what you're saying too is just the understanding of the ways in which we have caused harm as humans. And people are really struggling with that, because normally when we are dealing with a reckoning of causing harm, it's more on the one-to-one level. And as a society, we're dealing with the ways in which we've caused harm in a bigger scale than we've really done in contemporary times. And so, you know, not like, are people ready for it, but like the willingness to engage in those topics. Like, if you're going to read, like, if I'm imagining reading your book, one of the things I'm going to grapple with is the ways in which I have contributed poorly to the health of our environment, sustainability, beyond just environmental sustainability, but others. And like, that's not a big ask, but it's an ask.
It is. I mean, it's sort of like, I think about a friend who just made a documentary about Afghanistan. Sort of like, oh, do I have this the wherewithal to watch a documentary? I know what that is. I know how terrifying it is. I think one of the things that with this book, and I have recently, I guess about a year ago, kind of began to understand that there's actually a whole new genre of memoirs, like called climate change memoirs, that they're written about in this way. Yeah, there was a profile in the New Yorker on 4 climate change memoirs, and I think it is difficult because there is an existential dread sort of to it. I think the thing that and I think I was caught in that for a long time, and I was caught in the blame loop. Like, am I to blame? Are they to blame? How like, is it ExxonMobil? Is it my dad? If I write this, is it like the climate change equivalent of a Nazi apologist? Like just so many, mental gymnastics around it. And I kind of have settled on the fact that it's just about telling these human stories and all their complexity and all their glory. I mean, there's some amazing, I've gone through and found these, there was a woman who named Estelle Sharp, whose husband was actually, his name was Walter Sharp, and he was the partner of Howard Hughes Sr. So Howard Hughes Jr. was, Pan American, and is the famously reclusive, saving his pee in jars toward the end of his life, but hugely wealthy Hollywood figure. And his father was in Sour Lake and partnered with this man named Walter Hughes. They had what was called the Sharp Hughes Tool Company, and they made like drill bits that he drilled the wells with, and did other things. But he died early on. He died in 1912, and 40 years later, in 1952, his wife, Estelle, was like, all of these stories of the oil field, all of these pioneers of the oil field are dying off. Now, granted, this is 1952, so oil was much less complicated.
Right.
Interstate highways are being built. Cars are getting it. You can go from one place to the other. It's this like triumphant story of America and progress.
Yeah.
And she wanted to collect these stories, and you go back and listen, and they are wild, and they are fun, and they're like recordings of them. You can actually, some of them are online. They're archived here at the University of Texas, and you can hear the men's voices, and they're not only a repository of memory, but also they're saving these very distinctive dialect, like Texas like accents that are flattening. All of our accents are flattening with sort of like the proliferation of communication and global, like this global connection, which has all of its benefits, but it does kind of like dumb down our sort of regional tendency. And the stories are great. And, there's all this conflict I have, because in these stories, there's racism and there's sexism, and there's, and they're also pulling oil out of the ground, which is the thing that is maybe going to is causing the demise of many, many species, maybe even the demise of our own species. And yet they're colorful. It's a glimpse into a life. It's what they were thinking then. It helps us understand the full spectrum of it. And there are also like parts of it where there's like extreme ingenuity in ways. And this is the thing that I keep going back to that's hopeful, is like, granted, we have set things in motion that we really shouldn't have. Had we known better, had we been thoughtful, had we been more aware, we probably wouldn't have set in motion. And yet humans are extremely adaptable, extremely ingenious, that there are these moments of leaps forward that we couldn't even imagine. And that's to be celebrated too, that the same faculty that we created the problem with, and this, I guess, this is kind of like the undoing of that Albert Einstein quote, but about you can't solve the problem from the same mentality that you created it from. But it's the same mechanism of human, adaptability and ingenuity that can get us out of this.
Yes. Well, you have to know it, right? To be able to, you have to know where the problem sourced. It makes me think, I was at the Museum of the American Indian, National Museum of the American Indian in DC this fall, and there's a treaties room. And in the treaties exhibition, they have it displayed in such that it tells you the American Indian perspective on that treaty, and then the white colonist perspective. And then it really did this beautiful way, though, of then explaining how cultures are different in the way that they share information, hear information, and make agreements and things. And I'm thinking, like, in the same way that you're looking at the environmental things, you to be fair to the whole narrative is to share all of those parts. It's to share from, those that benefited from the oil being removed, like that provided livelihood, and families were supported financially through that work. And there's that can't, that is part of it. And yes, it did also do this other thing, but I'm just picturing like you're being able to show and discuss both of those things through this story, but humanizing, Brene Brown always talks about that, like dehumanizing is like a strategy for how we make decisions that hurt other people a lot of times.
Yeah.
But the fact that you are also humanizing the people who worked in this industry, so that we can't just do that lump easy thing, like everyone's bad, all of it was bad. It's like, no, they're humans behind this. Also, oral stories are just, I'm so fascinated by this right now. I'm like thinking so much about how important is it to capture oral stories and oral histories. And like, that is just, I don't know what else to say about it other than like inside, I feel everything about that when I think about it. And that you were talking about this woman, Estelle Hughes. Was that her last name, Hughes?
Sharp.
Oh, I got her the wrong last name. But just that she was part of that, and that she realized, like, we need these stories. Like, that's incredible.
Well, and one of the things that disturbs me about those stories is that there are no women there. There's only one woman who gets interviewed. She gets interviewed with her husband. And so there's actually only one. This is the only record in that entire, I think they did 700 hours worth of interviews. It was a huge project.
Wow.
And one woman's voice. And she talks about what it's like to like try to make a home in an oil field in like these palmetto, like these bagels and like swampy places in a little town called Batson, which was like, it was the worst oil field. It was very close to Sour Lake. It was the boom right after Sour Lake. And about what would happen when the meat man would come by in his little wagon and sell meat to them, and how they would get food, and what they would do at holidays, and how they would they would cut down these yopon branches. That yopon hollies have these red berries, and they would decorate their homes with palmetto fronds and yopon berries and yopon branches with their red berries. And there was just something so beautiful about that human, the aspect that wasn't just, being in these muddy, mucky oil field, like driving down into the earth and trying to like mine this resource and get rich, and all of these messy men telling like one-upping each other, whatever. So it's important for me to have examined this record and to like privilege those voices too.
Yes. Yeah.
It's very, very moving to me.
Yeah. Oh, well, I look forward to when this book comes to its final place, wherever that ends up being. And I hope I'll be able to read it, because I do think that stories of the ways we live help us remember too, that we all live, like there's connectedness in all the ways that we live, like whether we're geographically in the same place or not, or even in the same time era. Like, that's fascinating to me too, the continuity. I mean, it's part of why I love pinching small pots, is because it's an act that's been done for tens of thousands of years by humans. And so when I do that, I'm doing the same thing that somebody who lived in a very different place, a very different time, did as well. And that I love that there's an opportunity to still do something that's connected through that time.
Well, that's an experience of the sublime. That's like the equivalent of standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling like your belly kind of flop and your knees go weak at looking at the expanse ahead of you. Is like you have this like, I'm just a tiny little person in this grand history of humanity, but also of the planet and universe. I don't know.
So before, I know we need to wrap up. So, but there's two things I do want to know just a smidge more about. And one
Okay.
is about your photography practice and your drawing that you mentioned that you've started. And then the
Mhm.
other is about where do you write? Do you have favorite places that you write or research, or do you have a space that sort of like calls to you for that practice, or is it more you can do it anywhere or anything like that? So a little more about the art part of what you've been exploring and doing, the visual art part, and then about where you work and how you work.
So the photography, I think I probably do have to root my one of the problems that I have with myself is I feel like I need training and something to give myself permission to do it, and I'm trying to get out of that a little bit. But I didn't start really thinking of myself as someone who knew how to take photographs until after I'd taken some photography classes. And at this point, I think if you look at my Instagram, it's just pictures of nature. And I get lots of like teasing from friends, and one of my friends, her husband was like, "Oh, I seen you on Instagram taking pictures of the sky and shit." And I was just so a lot of times if I take pictures of clouds, I'll tag my friend's husband in them just so he'll know that I'm throwing him a little shade. But I think it's, the natural world is, I believe humans create beautiful things, but so often what we create has its origin in something we see in nature, in an arch, in the way that some sort of branch arches, or in the intricacy or the pattern of a flower.
Yeah.
So that the textures and the shapes and the colors and everything in the natural world is what inspires us to make. And to me, it doesn't translate as much to I have my cousin's husband. He's the painter who painted
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
Which, by the way, I don't know if you can see, but Andy Ness is right there.
Oh, yay, Andy, yes.
Sorry, this is not great for a podcast, but
I can edit whatever we need, but also it's sweet.
Or I can send you pictures of them.
Yeah, please do if you want to.
With show notes. But I see my cousin Bradley. He does a lot where he'll take a picture of a very like frondy. He'll be in a greenhouse, and he'll take a picture, and then he plays with like texture and dimension and color and flattening, this 3D experience into a hyper 2D, clearly two-dimensional world in ways that so directly translates. For me, it's more like the way that my photography sort of like integrates in my larger creative life is a practice of paying attention and noticing those moments that do give me pause, noticing like whatever it is that makes me stop and try to grapple with whatever it is that made me stop. And so it's also just like a way of just like being engaged with the world and not checking out. And so I take a lot of pictures on my phone of the way that a bald cypress looks right on there's a creek right by my house called Shoal Creek. And interestingly, I run this trail all the time. And maybe 2 months ago, I don't know why, but it was like the first time I had ever noticed this huge bald cypress. And I was just like, this makes this place new and wonderful. And then the other part that I have been like trying to do more of, it started last year where I started drawing, and I started drawing in my journal, and I was kind of doing these. I think it was because I was in New York with Suleika and her mother's a visual artist, and Suleika was painting these watercolors, painting her way through, newly being in cancer treatment and this bone marrow transplant. And I think maybe I just was doodling one day in my journal while my project had been to listen to 5 minutes of Virginia Woolf's The Waves. So I'm sorry, let me step back. We were doing another 100-day project. And what I had chosen to do was 5 minutes of listening to the waves and then using like some image, some phrase, some sentence as a springboard to writing whatever came to me. And I think one day while I was listening, I drew a butterfly, and it was, just very like, very simplistic. But then I got interested in having my hand do something while I was in those 5 minutes that I was listening.
Yeah.
And so for about a month, I just did that. And then it's a whole story of how this unfolded. It was very much the same kind of yes, where I just followed these associations, which is kind of how my mind works. But I ended up deciding to draw moths, which I found very resonant because Virginia Woolf's book, The Waves, was originally entitled The Moths. I'd stumbled on a moth, and then I decided I'm drawing moths for the rest of the 100 days. And I just started Googling pictures. I wasn't drawing from my mind's eye. I started Googling different images of moths. I got absolutely obsessed with them, just like the differences. And then some of them creeped me out.
I know, some are so freaky.
The furry ones, like, get them out of here. But they were just so beautiful, and they were so different. And I was just doing pen and ink, and I learned that I have like a natural inclination toward sort of proportion, that I was able to do this. And it made me just feel, it was so powerful to be like, no, I can do this thing that I'd always told myself I couldn't do, this thing that I haven't been trained to do, that I didn't have an expectation I was going to be good at it. I just tried it. And it felt it was like, what a bonus to like actually be decent about this, to like do this thing and then feel proud of what I made. And that was just very bolstering, and it was fun. And I don't normally like I've been such a working writer for so long that I don't associate writing with fun. It's a thing I know that I have skill in. It's like a skill I've honed. It's how I make a living, but it's often a very solitary practice, and it requires a type of focus and intention that will leave me feeling tired. And drawing just felt like exercising a totally different part of my brain. And so now I've been recently trying to watercolor. And it's kind of the same thing. Like I can have fun with it. It can be my area of play. And and I keep doing this thing where I'm like, and I'm never going to be a professional painter. And then I'm like, but
you might,
Why am I for closing possibilities?
Yes. Why do you tell yourself, but I'm not? But also sometimes when we say, but I'm not going to, it also frees us then to not worry about an audience to the thing we're doing. So there's always that too.
Yeah.
I have some friends, and we call, like what you're describing, we call it parallel practice. And so we're like, what's your parallel practice? What's the thing that you're kind of doing that moves at creative energy, but isn't about your professional things you make? And so we, like, one of my friends, her parallel practice is dance, and a specific kind of 5 rhythms dance, and others it's writing, and others it's gardening. But we all have what we consider a parallel practice to our work, and that's a place of nourishment for the other work and for ourselves, but like that it also isn't the work that you need to be professionally known for, but it's the work that's important alongside. So that's kind of, if that helps.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love those shortcuts. The idea. It's like, I can immediately see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, okay, tell us about where you work. Like when you do write, what's your, do you write like where I'm seeing you today? Do you write other places? Kind of what do you do? And can you write when you travel, or is that hard? Kind of how do you do those things?
I do not write in coffee shops. I do not write in public. I mean, I can journal in public or at coffee shops, but I'm very sensitive to my physical space and I'm sensitive to noises. I'm best at writing on a deadline. So if I'm traveling and I have a deadline, I can definitely write. I'm very motivated again by those external forces. But if I'm doing my own creative work, or even like things that I write or edit for the isolation journals, I'm here in my home. I'm at this is kind of like a high counter, and I have like an open space kitchen living area. And I move between this high counter where I can stand and write. I sit on my couch a lot with a pillow in my lap with my laptop. I sit at my table. I move around a lot. And that is one of the reasons why I can't work in a coffee shop. I'll feel just sort of, if there's some sort of discomfort in my physical body, then I need to be able to get up and move. I also need my books. I'm very sensitive to aesthetic things. So if something's ugly right in front of me, I'm going to look at it and be like, why is that ugly thing there? Get that ugly thing away from me. So I kind of have to have a certain amount of control over my environment. To do it on a regular basis, and to do it without some sort of external force.
That resonates for me. Okay, so I have some final questions that I ask each guest that we're going to end with our conversation today. And we just call this studio time wrap up.
Okay.
And so the first one is finish the sentence. And it is, when I don't know what to create or write, I
either read or I go for a run.
The next one is about your 5 songs. So I asked you to share 5 songs that you can listen to on repeat. So, and I think why I like that thought is just like, there's certain things we can do. Cause it's hard though, because new music comes into our lives. So, you can't say what's your favorite, but like songs that just come with ease. So the 5 songs that you shared are Fast Car by Tracy Chapman, The Promise by Sturgill Simpson, When in Rome cover, 16 Maybe Less by is it Calexico? Calexico. Oh, like Mexico, but Calexico. Got it. And then Iron and Wine. And then Texas Sun by Karungben. Is that how you say it?
I think it's like Karungben. It's a Houston-based band, and I think that's a town a city in Thailand. And they said that if they had known that they were going to be successful, they would have chosen a name that was easier to say. Nobody can say it. No English speakers, at least.
And that's with Leon Bridges. And then Summer's End by John Prine. And so I'm wondering if you could share how these songs maybe contribute to a creative flow for you.
So I don't, similarly to like not being able to see ugly things, I can't hear words when I'm writing, but there is a way that I think these songs, why I return to them. And as I was typing them out, I was like, I was noticing the theme is either like loss or nostalgia or longing. Like there's like definitely like a distance between this. And actually right now I'm reading this, a friend just gave me Rebecca Solnit's essay collection, A Field Guide to Getting Lost. She has this, the second essay is called The Distance of Blue.
Yeah. And
you may know what I'm about to talk about, but she's talking about atmospheric perspective and the way that we see blue as a color because somehow the light has gotten lost. So what we see is sky blue or water blue is actually some sort of like some part of the color spectrum or the spectrum of light, not actually reaching our eyes, which is just kind of like wild to think about.
Know.
But she says, if you can look across the distance without wanting to close it up, if you can your own longing in the same way that you own the beauty of that blue that can never be possessed. Like this idea that there's something so deep in me that loves that longing, that yearning, that sense of distance. And I think if I think about what it makes me want, it's that the creative practice allows me to close that distance. Like there's some distances we can never close, but that writing through something, or, for other visual artists, like making something, it allows you to close that gap of yearning and that gap of desire. And it may be that desire and reframing desire and longing as something to be desired and cherished as its own emotion, or as its own thing is fine, but also that our creative practice can be the place that where we close up the things that can't be closed.
What brings you joy in your creative life?
I think making those connections, and it's not always like closing. It's not the same thing as closing the distance, but I love when I read something and I think this is like that, or I can apply this to that. It's that way. It's that moment where like some synapse fires and it just makes me feel alive, and that the workings of my own brain are pleasurable and joyous in and of themselves.
Okay, the final one is to finish the sentence. My creativity is. Your face.
I'm tempted to make jokes here.
You can have more than one answer. You could
self-deprecating. My creativity is it's growing. It's I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't my creativity is growing, and it's steadying, and it is both a path forward and sort of a circling back. And there's this way that it's allowing me to step into the fact that it's growing, and the fact that I'm figuring out new ways of being creative, and that I'm owning. A few years ago, I kind of began to understand that writing was a way of life, and it wasn't necessarily for the outcome of what I wrote. I think I may have shared this in a hatch before about seeing two writers, two mentors reconnecting and speak, and the way that they found such joy in seeing each other and talking about books and this deep connection through an artistic medium. I understood, like, this is not about me being published in a particular way or becoming a bestseller. This is about a way of life. This is about rooting myself in a creative practice that gives me joy for whatever reason. And that's what I think it is now. It's like a coming to understand a big part of being what it means to be human, a big part of what it means to, like, something I've learned so much from Suleika is like how we move through hard things and the way that we use creativity to do that. And yeah, like, I feel like it's my creativity is fullness.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That was circuitous.
That was perfect. Thank you. Thank you for today too, Carmen. Thanks for talking with me and being open and sharing your story.
Oh, it was such a delight. I'm so honored, and also just a joy to spend this time with you.
Let's take inspiration from Carmen and think of our creative paths as a river stream. Consider blocking an hour of time this week to write 300 words or draw about your creative path as a river stream. Where does it ebb? Where does it flow? And remember, as Carmen shared, rejections are just the work we have to do when we put ourselves and our work out into the world. Rejections become neutral when we think of them as just the work we have to do. So a bonus inspiration and challenge for the week: put yourself out there, apply to some opportunities, get that rejection work done for the week. And if you're looking for a generative online writing community, come over to the Isolation Journals. We will be there welcoming you. If you enjoy the podcast, please share it, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcast. If you are new to the podcast, be sure to check out Season 1 episodes wherever you listen. As always, thank you so much for joining me. Bye.